Can anxious parents raise well-adjusted kids, or do these kids have to wait until they're way into adulthood to figure their own shit out and then heal themselves?
I think yes.
Sirsa, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I've known you for many years. We both grew up in Amman mostly, and we are here the second Friday of Ramadan under lockdown. So, Sirsa, you are a child development and parenting specialist. You've been trained in different places. You spent most of your education, higher education in the US, and then you went back for more at Yale. You did another course. And
Wow,
then
you
you've
did your
been,
research.
yeah, the minimum, the LinkedIn skim, I call it. And then you came back to Jordan and you've been working with different kinds of communities a few years back, mostly focusing on East Amman, more marginalized, I would say, clients. Right now, you're more focusing on parents and kids in West Amman. Tell us about being in child development and parenting in Jordan.
Okay, man, that's such a broad question. Where do I start? Well, it's funny when I always knew that I wanted to work with kids, but I knew that I didn't want to be a teacher. So I found, I think, the discipline that really worked for me because it was so multidisciplinary. There was a bit of anthropology that I was interested at the time, women's studies courses that I took, obviously a lot of family studies courses. And people were like, why are you doing this work, Yani? Why are you working? Just wanting to develop further in this field. And I thought at the time, like, are they onto something? Should I not be doing this? Is this something that I shouldn't really pursue? And then the more I got into it, everything just kind of fell into place. I thought that it was the exact fit for me. And now I know more than ever that there is this huge demand and this huge need for people like me and obviously similar professionals, whether it's here, whether it's global. Because there was a gap in the market in terms of who can help support parents and children at a kind of a behavioral and maybe social emotional level that pediatricians were not able to address and schools definitely were not able to address. This became very apparent, I would say maybe the last 6-7 years. And that's basically when I decided, okay, maybe it's time for me to move out of the NGO and development sector and maybe establish something on my own.
Okay.
But in a nutshell, I think it was just a very smooth and gradual progression of me really focusing on, first of all, studying about how children develop and then also about healthy family functioning and how parents and families can contribute to the healthy development of children. And when I graduated from the States, I applied to either 12 or 13 NGOs at the time, and I think maybe a few private sector agencies. And I got one response back. And that was the place that I ended up working at. I worked with JRF, the Jordan River Foundation, and I was doing a lot of child protection work from about 2006 to 8 years after. Yeah, 2013, I think, is when I left.
And the work was in Jordan, in Amman, or outside of the capital?
I was localized in East Amman. First, I was part of the first team that established a child helpline in the country. So I did that. I set up the first child helpline with an amazing group of other women and professionals. And then I moved into child abuse prevention programming. We'd work with within a lot of governorates. We did a lot of capacity building programs with professionals. I did a lot of work in Aqaba also. At the time, we had another center that we were setting up there.
The Child Helpline project, is this something that caters to parents themselves calling in or for children themselves?
Both. It's about any problem or any challenge that has to do with a child. And so parents can call in if they have a quick question or a quick reference that they need. And then children can also call in if they're being bullied at school, if they want to report abuse.
And has that project been successful?
It has been. And they actually launched during the quarantine, which was amazing. They launched, I think, during the second week, where they were also offering a lot of support to families and to children. Because what we've been noticing is there are some studies that are now coming up in times of crisis that rates of violence against women and child abuse go up in these situations.
Yeah, that's true. There is a global uptick in home violence. Well, the children are the
Of
victim or the
course.
wife in the most cases. So during lockdown, you mentioned that they activated the line.
They activated it, yes.
I wanted to ask you about child development and psychology. A lot of it boils down to parenting at the end of the day. So, everything I would try
No
to think
pressure,
about,
Imad.
yeah, everything I would think about to discuss with you, most of it ended up in the parenting bucket. as opposed to the child as an entity. Can you improve the environment of children without dealing with the issues that parents have themselves, issues of anxiety that the parents have, certain tendencies that are negative?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When I first started off doing private practice work, I went the course that you mentioned at Yale. It was strictly to target parents of children that have maybe oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorders children might be facing, and how do you train parents to work with children, under these quote unquote categories. So I did that for a while, and then slowly and with much more conviction, I felt like there was obviously a link missing. So working with the child was also missing. And so
Mm,
a few years after, I did another certification in something called family based play therapy. And it's really grounded in a lot of mindfulness work. This approach is very different than something called child centered therapy, where a person will just work with the child on their own, which works. But I don't feel that it works to the degree that you need it to in order for it to be really sustainable. And if you really want to fix the dysfunctions that are happening in the family. So when I work with the family holistically, and I'm predominantly obviously working with the child, but I always, and it's one of my kind of principles and go-tos, and it's based on the methodology that I didn't create. I mean, I was trained in it, but it's very much, it comes from a very strong conviction that in order for you to create sustainable change and a lot of awareness and promote this very meaningful dialogue in a family, you can't do it without both parties being involved. And sometimes it even means like inviting siblings to some of the sessions as well,
wow.
because you're working holistically and as a family, and you have to think in terms of a case by case basis if that needs to happen. You can do work at a child centered level, but I don't think that you will get very far if you don't engage parents as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've experienced this. There's been a lot of theory that says, and when you become a parent yourselves, it's almost like you're reworking through a lot of your own childhood issues. And for
Yeah.
a lot of parents, they can be triggered, but they don't necessarily know what they're being triggered by. And it's usually the child's behavior, and they don't necessarily know where it comes from. So it really helps to have these conversations for someone to point out these parallels within the work.
Wow, that's interesting that you mention parallels, like the inner child of the
Mm,
parent themselves. How me as a parent, I do get triggered, not even knowing it, by a certain
for
behavior.
sure.
And it's usually something that reflects back on me, something that maybe I don't like about myself that the child is now doing. I get triggered by it. One area that causes parents anxiety and then reflects negatively on the kid is that we pin a lot of our happiness on the child reflecting a certain behavior and image that our inner child wants us to be. So when they
Yeah.
do that, we reward them. And then when they veer away from that ideal that we have in our mind that we maybe inherited from our own parents as well, we kind of get anxious and triggered. You're right. Can anxious parents raise well adjusted kids, or do these kids have to wait until they're way into adulthood to figure their own shit out and then heal themselves?
I think I can split down the clients that I'm currently work with into a 50-50 ratio, where 50% they have a lot of conduct issues like anger management and emotional regulation issues, and then the other 50 is anxiety. And so, can anxious parents raise well adjusted children? I think yes. What has been the benchmark of success, or a success rate, if I would call it, is parental awareness. So if you have an aware parent that comes in and really knows that this is one of the things that they're struggling with, then half of the challenge you've overcome. Because working with a parent that's either very much in denial or doesn't want to look inwards and doesn't want to work on themselves, that's the
Mm,
really challenging aspect. But a parent that is very self-aware, a parent that is also kind of working on their own emotional regulation, a parent that's really able to kind of themselves take on these different strategies to develop their own coping mechanisms, that's the ultimate model for your child. I mean, we sit and we talk and we walk and we eat and we teach kids all of these different skill sets. But then when it comes to how we regulate emotionally, we think that children aren't looking at us and
mm,
that they're not learning from our behavior on a day-to-day basis. My friends call me up sometimes, they're like, oh, my toddler picked up the phone and threw it at the wall. And then, as we discuss, I ask her, have you ever done that? She's like, oh, yeah, I throw my phone at the wall all the time. I'm like, so why are you surprised that a child is actually imitating that? But I mean, in terms of even these sometimes very negative coping skills, a lot of the times children will pick up on that. And especially during times like these, yani during the coronavirus, you reminded me of one mom that I work with that's extremely anxious. I'm also working with her 6-year-old child that is also extremely anxious, who's refusing to go out because he thinks that there's corona on the street. And the mom during week 3 and week 4 was getting very frustrated. But during week 1 and week 2, she had literally kept this child hostage in the home, not even going on daily walks because she herself was that afraid that they were going to catch corona in the streets. And I mean, I understand it was a very scary time, but I don't think that during her tumultuous and anxious period, she wasn't noticing what she was modeling to her child.
Yeah. How reversible are they if a parent, like that mom you mentioned, if she becomes more aware quickly within a few months and she adjusts, is the child, when is it like there's irreparable harm to the child? When is it very long term, or even 1 second could cause damage?
It's always something that we grapple with, I think, within this field. But listen, if I didn't necessarily believe in change, I wouldn't be in the profession that I'm in. And I see change all the time. It doesn't happen overnight. Sometimes it's a minimum of about, I tell parents, it's a minimum of a 4-month commitment to do the work until we start seeing these very gradual steps towards progress. But do we believe that change is possible? Yes, even over the course of a few months and obviously years of the parents working on themselves in order to develop their own coping strategies and mechanisms, then yes, we do see an impact on kids. Now, to go back to the second part of your question, which is when is it, maybe you're asking essentially when is it traumatic and when is it kind of irreversible? There are so many factors that come into play. The basics are the age of the child, what's their level of understanding. Another issue is kind of the attachment relationship itself between the parent and the child. Has it been a relatively functional relationship between them that like one incident may not be as damaging as if it's a very unhealthy, dysfunctional and abusive relationship, then obviously that will create a more negative impact. All of these factors come into play, and that's why it's really important to again look at the individual family. You look at the individual child, you really gather as much data as you can when you're working with a specific family, and you try, obviously every week by week, when I see the kids and the parents, I'm picking up on patterns too. So what's the pattern that has developed within this family, and how is it serving the child? Is it doing more harm than good? And so we really work with the parents reconfiguring the interaction and the dynamic behind it. But what we know in terms of trauma is that they come in different size T's. There's a little T, a medium sized T, and then there are big T's, the big traumas. We all know that parents will, sorry, lose their shit. صح?
Yeah.
I mean, you do. It's human. But there's a particular psychologist that says, he's also a play therapist. He says it's not really important what happens in the moment. What's more important is what happens after the parents lose their shit,
Mm.
essentially. So is there a healing process that the parent will do, or the dialogue behind what just happened, and taking the time to explain to the child and taking the time to repair, the dips in the relationship. These are also very, very important skill sets when you're talking about, and even that can even come from an example of, you're in a very high state of anxiety as a parent and your child has witnessed you being in that spiral. So how do you talk to your child after things have calmed down? How do you process it with them, and how do you model that functioning? And it's practice. It may not happen again overnight, but at least the child is seeing that their parent is taking the necessary steps to taking care of themselves and ultimately taking care of them. Because one of the most dangerous things within, if you have a severely anxious parent or any parent with a mental illness, is if the child thinks that they need to take care of their parent.
Mm.
That can be just super overwhelming for children, and obviously it's very detrimental because it's not something that they're equipped to handle. And so as long as parents, again, we come back to this issue of self-awareness, they're very self-aware, they know what they need to do, they know also to acknowledge, even in the moment, if they say, I'm having a really tough time, I'm really angry, or I'm really anxious, or I'm really sad, just giving also the feeling a name and framing it for children makes it less scary and makes the child better able to handle whatever is happening at that current time.
Wow. I mean, yeah, I definitely identify with the need for and the benefit of letting them in on even your own emotions and what's going on, and across the
Yeah.
board. I mean, maybe an extreme would be a parent that, for example, tells their kid, "Oh, there's a dangerous thing outside. The police said you can't go out, and that's it, done." Versus a parent that actually explains to them what's actually happening, what is this virus, how many people are getting sick, the fact that it's not
Yeah.
that scary if you're careful, and going into depth about it as opposed to just like being very strict. It makes me think about also in general how parents, because we're overwhelmed with the schooling and the finances and the behavioral stuff and making sure they're not victims of anything and managing our own stuff, sometimes we take shortcuts and we do the shortcuts at the expense of letting them in on everything. For example, using the carrot and the stick or the reward system, which I call it lazy parenting, and I resort to it daily, unfortunately, where let's say my child doesn't want to go to bed and he's still watching TV and I scream at him, "Yalla, time's up," and he doesn't. And then instead of telling him, "You need to stop looking at screens, it's getting late, you'll have a better night's sleep if you get off the TV earlier," and giving him the whole story, I
Yeah.
just tell him, "Okay, you're not having a play date on Thursday. If you don't get off right now, you have 3 seconds." And he immediately responds to the carrot and the stick, the punishment, the reward
Yeah.
thing. And I also save myself a lot of time. Is this method, Yani, what do you think about this whole idea of getting kids in line using the reward and the punishment issue?
This is something that we can debate, I mean, for hours on end. Obviously, there's a level where you just need to get them through their daily schedules at time, and there's so much going on, and you need kids to kind of just follow through on your requests and orders. So to a certain level, it's normal because kids also need to understand that fun things end. The world doesn't work according to what they need and want all the time. I think that's one of the most significant lessons actually that children learn, and it's kind of at the basis of emotional regulation. So how do I learn how to cope with things that disappoint me and when they don't go my way? At the same time, I think there is such a heavy fixation on children's compliance, which I find astounding. We really love to control kids. And we don't think about the ramifications of what blind compliance at times might create. We expect kids to always give that yes, sir, or yes, ma'am attitude. And we want them to obey, we want them to comply with whatever we're asking. But then there's a price that we pay when children are that compliant. I mean, they just become not really capable of thinking for themselves, not capable of taking any initiative in certain situations. It's a huge child protection issue in terms of, there's this adult authority figure, but if a child is just blindly complying, does that mean that this child is maybe at a greater risk of being abused by this person because he's simply older? So the carrot and the stick doesn't and shouldn't work all the time. I think what I would encourage parents to do is to really engage in a meaningful dialogue, because you also don't want kids to always rely on an external factor to monitor and push for their behavior. What you want them to
Hmm.
develop is internally this: am I convinced by why my dad is asking me to go to sleep? Am I okay with it? Has he heard me out? Maybe it's a bigger issue of maybe the child is fearful of sleep, but maybe the parent isn't really realizing that he is, and maybe he just thinks that the child is being difficult. There are so many issues that might come up from this issue of not wanting to go to bed. It's the classic childhood issue. Every behavior is a way of communication for children. Even with me, I'm constantly surprised with the internal, sometimes messaging of children that they're not able to verbalize, but will come out in very indirect ways.
Yeah, I mean it's incredible. I wanted to ask you about when do parents, especially in West Amman, that you've been working with in a private practice setting, where parents are probably more hands-on because they're more well off, placing their kids in different activities for their own development, whether it's athletics or art or music. This has been a struggle with my kids. A musical instrument requires a lot of discipline, a lot of
Mm.
practice. You're not going to have any meaningful progress with a musical instrument unless you have a lot of discipline with it. It's easy for kids to give up and not to want to apply themselves to learning an instrument because it takes so much patience. So, us as parents, we sometimes think, oh, these kids are just not used to any kind of discipline. It's our job to push them and push them and push them. And if your kid says, you know what, I hate piano after months of struggling with it, for us parents, where do you know when to say, you know what, that's fine, now you can give up?
Right.
Where do you draw the line?
That's one of the very hard also parenting questions that I get a lot. You can use it for a variety of different examples is when do I push and when do I give my child the agency and the authority for making that decision? So it really depends on a variety of different factors, but I always encourage parents at the beginning of the year when you're first choosing activities, do you engage with your child in actually making that decision together? So if you have ownership from them at the beginning, like, okay, I want violin versus the flute, and your child chose the violin, and it's almost like you also have some form of leverage over them.
Mhm.
And I think one of the second factors is you're actually teaching them the importance of committing and following through something. So one of the rules is if I've paid for it, you're going to finish it. So it's kind of this issue of we've committed and you're also working with them on that level of commitment, and then you would push through with your child. Thirdly, it would be how really miserable is the child. There are a lot of kids that have a lot of resistance going to the actual piano lesson, but once they're there, they actually enjoy it. And so it's maybe just that the child is struggling with that initial transition. And so if they're not completely miserable, then push through. But if they are really miserable, then you might really want to dig a little bit deeper and figure out why that is. And then that goes into the fourth issue, which is the child really resisting, whether it's a sport or art or music, whatever it is, because she might be feeling very frustrated with an inability to move beyond a certain skill level, or she's finding a lot of frustration in terms of maybe she's not really getting it, or maybe other kids in the class are better than her. We really want to understand what the issue is. And usually it really comes back to this issue of children need help building their frustration tolerance levels. And so sometimes they will, obviously, they want the easy way out. And it's the same thing with homework because it frustrates them. And so they might not necessarily know that they're avoiding the skill set, but I think what they're really avoiding is the feeling behind it. And so, again, how do you help and how do you work with your child on being able to sit with that very tough emotion? And we're living in this world that's very fast paced. Children are disconnected from nature. There's so much pressure. Children are put into all of these activities throughout the year. Academics are getting more and more challenging. Breaks are less in school. There's more standardized testing. And kids are under a lot of pressure. And at the same time, they're not being supported enough, whether it's by parents who are not in a blaming way, but just because our life and parental life has become so fast paced, or the school system has not really allowed for a lot of space for supporting social and emotional development. So they're missing out on this opportunity to really sit with this frustration. And this is ultimately maybe why a child is asking why I don't want to do this activity anymore. And so is there this, again, we go back to my favorite word, which is dialogue, because I just see how powerful and how effective it is. Whether it's about anxiety or frustration or anger, once there's a constant awareness to it and a constant dialogue where the child is able to sit with the feeling and work through it, then it just gets less. But imagine how powerful it is that you're actually being able to build these 6, 7, 8-year-old brains to be able to sit with these feelings, and how much better equipped they will be in their 20s than we were. Their brains are so plastic at this age, and you really want to take this opportunity to help them reconfigure the wiring in their brains where it doesn't become so overwhelming to go to piano class and feel frustrated each and every time because someone is helping me understand it and work through it.
Yeah, I totally agree that debate and being conscious is one of those rare things that are certain in parenting, that they are a positive thing. I
For any
often, yeah,
relationship, though,
for any
Imad, right?
relationship, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I feel there's so much that is unknown in terms of results and unknown in terms of what should parents follow. Along a spectrum, if you're at the extreme end of a spectrum of where a parent is tormenting and abusive and causing fear, that's obviously terrible. And then the other side of the spectrum, which is total neglect and really not having any support. But a big chunk of the spectrum, which is right in the middle, there is where I feel like there are almost no rules. There's no measurable outcomes. Hence, there are no measurable behavioral things that you can really guarantee. Let me give you an example from this week that's hilarious. Homeschooling now under lockdown, God bless my wife for uh, taking the brunt of that. Now they're introducing video conferencing with kids that are live. You don't just watch the video later. You actually have to be with a bunch of kids at the same
Right.
time. And one of my kids wants to be there on time, wants to make sure that the laptop is configured properly, could log in and do all that stuff. So him and my wife are on top of things for that. And then they discovered that one of the kids in the group, that her parents don't even wake up for that. They're not even,
Wow.
nobody's up for that. So that kid is doing this independently. Comparing it to my child who has this anxiety over making sure that it's right, and he pulls us
Yeah,
into the process. And I think to myself, man, that child whose parents aren't even awake is building a skill of independence.
for
It's not a
sure.
negative thing. Before you see that example, you think that if you neglect your child's process in homeschooling, for example, they're going to go down a wrong path. But you look at this other child, so there's always two sides to every single thing a parent does with their kid, barring the severe neglect versus severe abuse. We're talking in the middle, there's evidence to support any kind of parenting style, almost the most uncertain endeavor that I've ever seen.
Yeah. I learn a lot from the parents that I work with, but everybody kind of says the same thing. It's probably the hardest thing that I think anyone can ever do. And when you ask me is how I got into this, there are obviously so many limitations to the work that I do and the advice and consultations that I provide. But what I really hope is that I'm able to kind of offer what the data might say, what the science might say, or offer maybe a reflective opinion on what I'm seeing from their child in the play therapy room that might help. I think that any data that you have on your child, and you're a father of three, you also might recognize that you maybe use different approaches with each one of your three children.
Uh,
Going back to the example that you provided of your son versus this student in the class, we don't know, like you said, what's going on in her household. She might turn out to be the most resilient of children. She's probably very gritty if she's figuring out all of these things on her own, extremely independent. And what I always like to remind myself is you think developmentally. So you think in terms of where your child is developmentally, because that's always been helpful to me as a professional when I'm working with a child. Because I could be working with two 6 year olds, but they can be on very different paces and phases of development emotionally, not just cognitively. And then you also think contextually. So, what's the context in terms of where this child is coming from, in terms of their home environment, and what are kind of, again, the dynamics within the household? And once you have those pieces of information, it's definitely easier to form an assessment or a judgment about how functional a child is versus maybe what's kind of the level of, I don't want to say damage, but maybe impact that a child
mm,
is under.
okay. About anxiety, I realized something regarding anxiety and schooling. I realized it much later on in life. In school, there was a lot of social anxiety growing up, especially teenage years, which is very common all over the world because you're in a group of hundreds of teenagers in one building, trying to learn,
Yeah.
trying to compete, trying to understand, trying to navigate especially in mixed schools, the boys and girls dynamic, and you're going through puberty. So it's a lot of stuff to deal with. At the
Yeah.
same time, you have to get good grades, you have to study, you have to practice. And after graduating, going to college, and getting married, in my 30s, I discovered something about anxiety as a teenager in high school that I never thought of. I went to visit a campus of a boarding school here in Amman, King's Academy. Beautiful environment for learning.
Yeah.
I visited the campus around when they first opened many years ago. I had been, done with high school for 15 years at that point, and it triggered something in me as I was walking through the hallways and the fields and looking at kids reading and studying in serenity in that environment. A thought came to my head. I'm like, oh my God, it drudged up these memories of social anxiety in high school. And not just the social anxiety by itself, but how it affected me from actually focusing on learning. And it drudged that up, and I was like, oh my God, if I was in this kind of environment, this new serene kind of learning environment, where there's open spaces. It's not all concrete. It's not all, wall to wall, just kids on top of each other, competing, and just like the sexual energy and the bullying and all that stuff crammed into one place. I was like, I
Mm-hmm.
would have done so much better because as a teenager, my grades did suffer from middle school towards graduation. And I had never thought of social anxiety as being part of what consumed my thought at home when I was supposed to
Wow.
be doing homework and studying. And I only discovered that 15 years after high school. And now my kids are in the same school. They're not teenagers yet, but I already see social anxiety in the school environment. And we're talking excellent schools. It's hard to find better schools than the private schools of West Amman, in the
Yeah.
region. And I can already see how social anxiety can inhibit a boy or girl from really diving into a subject matter like chemistry or biology or geography or even a hobby. They're just all this kind of pressure and this worry of being at school, even when they're happy. And my kids are thankfully they're happy, but there's that element that's inescapable when you're in a big group. And I accept it based on the idea that, well, this is the world. The world is rough. You're going to meet people. Some you're going to click with, some you're going to have issues with. So this is kind of good training for the world. But at the expense of getting the best grades and diving into a subject matter, it's a trade off between graduating into higher education with that really deep love for a subject matter versus diving into the social jungle that is high school.
It's very interesting. I think about this often as well. Maybe not so much social anxiety, but maybe just anxiety in general. And because I keep seeing it at earlier and earlier years, every year I'm doing this type of work. And it's heartbreaking. But if you're relatively functional and if you're still doing well as a teenager and you're experiencing, the normal adolescent issues, then it's okay. And sometimes anxiety can actually push you to do better and to perform. But sometimes when it's debilitating anxiety, and this is when it gets really heartbreaking. I worked with so many very young children. I worked with a little girl who was 7 that had such severe social anxiety, she couldn't even go to school. It took a good 5, 6 months to get her into the door. Other younger kids that are in preschools have something called selective mutism, where they refuse. It's astounding to work with these children because you just know that the willpower that they have is also extremely, extremely interesting. But also, it's heartbreaking because they're just so burdened by this anxiety where they feel nobody is supposed to hear their voices within a social setting. And so they're completely normal, completely happy in terms of behavior at home. But at school, in front of their teachers, in front of their friends, they're non communicative. So it's always important for parents to know is at what level, so kind of is there a meter that I can kind of assess where my child is. And so if it's kind of this anxiety that comes and goes, then you know that that also is building resilience, as long as you're also taking the time to really work with your children through it. But then there are other times when anxiety has a very dark face, and it can also often lead to depression amongst young children, because they tell if you're in a classroom and you're feeling super anxious, it's almost like there's a fire in your brain. Of course, you're not going to be learning and listening and engaging. And so, yeah, not only academically are you being extremely challenged, but there's in terms of your mental health and in terms of just your well-being.
Mm, yeah. Um, the decision to have children among couples and single people, it's such a fascinating decision to make. When I agreed to go down the fatherhood path, I wasn't as conscious as I was today, as conscious of my own self. I was coasting through life, trying to build a career, enjoying being with my wife as parents without kids. It was the best time. Even according to many happiness experts, the best time is to be with a companion, but not to actually have kids.
Did
It's
you
hap-
catch Dan Gilbert's?
I did. Yeah, you were there, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a funny thing. I know a lot of people now that are a couple but without kids.
Hmm.
Some are adamant that they don't want kids, yet they do kind of crack under some cultural pressure sometimes and they kind of feel like, oh, are
Yeah.
we going to regret it? And then some are on the way to having kids. They're pregnant and they don't know what's going to hit them. I can see how couples that are about to have their first child, I'm like, wow, okay,
You don't know what you're in for.
to prepare for this interview, actually, I listened to a bunch of conscious parenting interviews with different
Mm.
people, whether it's Oprah talking to experts, and such a fascinating topic. One thing that resonated with me as a parent is that a lot of parents think that they're going to be instilling a lot of their experience onto their kids. And that's the whole idea of parenting. You're going to be guiding them, you're going to be molding them. But there's some thinkers that say, actually, no. The reason to have a child is not to check the box. If you're just having a kid to check that box, you're in for a massive disappointment. If you're having kids so that you can pass on who you are and your legacy and all this stuff to them, emotionally, psychologically, they'll be very disappointed. The best reason to have a child is to learn. And that's something that stuck with me the last couple of days as I've been listening to people. So, how do you see the parents that come in? Do you ever think, oh my God, these parents, man, why did they have kids?
Of course. Super judgmental of me to think that. But what I will say is there are parents that come in and it's really a joy to work with them just because even if they're not that self-aware, but they're so open to learning. And so I call it like the light bulb moment is when we're talking and then something will just click with the parents. And like you can see in their eyes, they're like, oh my gosh, how did I not see this before about my child? And I think one of the real benefits that because I've been doing a lot of online sessions and telehealth sessions with parents over the past few weeks during quarantine. And the number one point of feedback they're telling me is that, Sirsa, this quarantine period gave me an opportunity to really see my child in a way that I have not before. And it really opened up my eyes to understanding and learning about my child's, tolerance level and frustration level and mental health, even some aspects of mental health and their levels of happiness, and just me also as a parent responding to that and my child. It's been a real eye opener for a lot of parents, and I think that that will do a world of good in the field of parenting, like you're saying. And I mean, maybe it's a blessing that you decide to become a parent at a time when you aren't really thinking about how hard it's going to be. But I think just like with everything in life, every phase that you go through has its advantages and disadvantages, and you're constantly learning about your child. But yeah, what you said is so true, is that children are the ultimate teachers. And I keep telling parents that, especially when you're working with a very problematic situation and maybe a child that is extremely challenging, they will turn you into the best version of the parent that you can be. And I think that once, the child and the parent come out of that process, that they also see it and they're very grateful.
You mentioned that there was a big gap in providing this kind of help to parents in our community here. Now that you've seen hundreds of parents and children over the years, you kind of understand the landscape of what parents in Jordan are dealing with and what kids are dealing with. How many parents and children would actually really benefit from seeing a specialist for a number of months, that it's important to them actually for them to see, versus the parents that are
Yeah,
like, you know what, they're fine, they don't need to see anybody? Is it a large number? And if it is, that's a big gap in the market. I mean,
correct.
when you think about fitness, there are 1,000 gyms in our city. Why? Because people over the last few decades have figured out that, you know what, it's healthy to go to the gym and it's a good routine
Right.
to have and it's good for you for your longevity, for your mind. So gyms open up and there's no shortage
Sure.
of gyms. There's like, they'll beg you to join. But in your field, let's say, do you feel like a lot of parents have no clue about this service and they would really benefit from it? And how do we get this kind of help to them, even on an institution level at their school, at least, if they don't have the
Yeah.
time or the money to actually visit a specialist? What do you think about that?
So basically, there are two main services. The first one, which when I work just with parents, it's usually a concern that a parent has in regards to their children's development. And it can be something very kind of simple as how do I potty train my child versus how do I deal with anger outbursts. And so I would work with the parents on offering that type of very specific consultation service that a pediatrician just does not have the time to cater to. And again, schools and preschools aren't providing those services, nor are they always trained to do so. And then the other one is the more mental health based service, which is a therapeutic service that parents and the child will come in and attend to on a weekly basis, and it's for a longer period of time. I think all parents require the first element of service. And I think now, especially with social media and blogs and specialists that are available that can answer a lot of times free of charge, that can offer this type of service. And it's been phenomenal witnessing this during the quarantine period, actually, where parents were getting a lot of calls and conferences going on. So there's a surge in these services that are offered to parents. On a more maybe therapeutic and long term basis for children with mental health concerns, or children whose parents are getting a divorce, for example, or children with developmental delays that might need more than one supportive service, I would say, statistically speaking, I think any child can benefit. Any child will benefit from having a service that is promoting his or her self esteem, mental well being. There's so much that these services can offer. But if you're talking about, children that have gone through very specific traumatizing events, then yes, there's such a shortage. And not, I mean, there's a cluster of services probably in Amman and maybe in the bigger cities in the north, because also due to the Syrian refugee crisis, there are so many international NGOs that are offering psychosocial services to refugee children. But at the very basic community level, locally and globally, I would say there isn't. And it's not very much a priority on public policy agenda, unfortunately. Not every family can afford a private service. So there's a need for it at a grassroots level, community-based level.
Hmm.
And there's also a need for it at a very specialized level. Like, you can specialize predominantly in anxiety, self-esteem development, or anger management. I mean, there's so many niche.
What about inside the school? I mean, what would your ideal school have in terms of child development services or anything like that?
Yeah. So there are a few schools in Amman that are starting to implement a mindfulness program. I mean, that's amazing, and it's definitely a start. And they're embedding these mindfulness programs into the day-to-day curriculum. I
Hmm.
think if we see that contextually created in order to meet these social and emotional learning for children, it would definitely have to be part of the curriculum. And it's not just, a class like we used to get back in the day when we were in school. They used to call it like a counseling lesson. No, it's something that's embedded within how the teacher reacts to the student and how the students react to themselves. And it's a general policy within the school setting, but it's very much embedded within the curriculum, and it's targeting mental health and mental well-being. And there's an awareness, and there's no longer this taboo about talking about your feelings with one another. You mentioned bullying in teenagers and how it's still a huge issue within schools. So I work with maybe younger adolescents, 12, 13, but every single one of them that I've spoken to is going through the same exact thing, but they don't know that the person next to them is going through that as well. And so they think that it's just them. And they feel this huge pressure that it's, I'm the only person that's going through this or that's feeling anxious in school. And they're completely oblivious to the fact that it's maybe 40 to 50%, if not higher, of your classmates that are experiencing the same thing, but they're not willing to talk about it, and they don't have the tools needed to talk about it, and they don't have someone readily available in all schools that is able to navigate and help with these types of conversations. So it requires funding, and it requires a lot of training. And how do you embed these programs just like you would embed any academic program?
Hmm. Growing up, I remember there was always a school nurse if you had a tummy ache or something minor. I don't recall there being in elementary schools an actual counselor. I remember there was later on in middle school and high school. So you're saying that it's much more effective to have something institutionalized as a program, part of the whole curriculum, as opposed to just having an on-call, on-duty counselor that serves for emergencies or for actual acute cases.
Well, both. The counselor would be part of that embedded program, and you would have these different support
Hmm.
services for students that would require additional support. They will definitely target different needs. And a school counselor is really important because he or she is the front line of mental health first aid. And counselors obviously support teachers as well. And from what I know, though, working with a lot of public schools, is there's a complete lack of that person.
Yeah, it's amazing how across the planet there's so much inequality with the services that are available to children based primarily on wealth of the parent. Even in wealthy countries, there's such a big disparity and services that are available for children. Even tests like the SAT test, the results are skewed towards kids with more resources, with more wealthy parents. because they can get them the test prep courses that are expensive.
Of
So
course.
even the standardized tests that are supposed to measure the child's aptitude are also skewed by resources.
Yeah, the
Um,
privilege. It boils down to
Privilege.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. And the public school system in Jordan is on my mind when I think of this pandemic and the lockdown. I've seen neighborhoods in East Amman right now where the kids are out in the streets from early morning because the homeschooling structure maybe isn't as it's not well structured, or the parents are unable to focus because of other commitments that they have. Yeah,
Or
it's the,
simply because they just don't have a smartphone. You're expecting children to go online and to be able to study online, but there are households that don't own computers, or they might have 6 and 7 kids, but and they all have online school. And so, how do you divide the school day among 6 and 7
that's so
children? I mean, it's
true.
yeah,
I mean, you're right. I was able to get an extra laptop from my company. I didn't even have to think about it, just so
right,
both my kids can do homeschooling. But
yeah.
yeah, my God, if you have one smartphone, two smartphones, and five kids, it's such a challenge.
So yeah, now you go into issues of child rights. So that's obviously for also another episode.
Yeah, my God,
But
we
it,
have. I mean, there's, eating habits, and then there's screen addiction, which I was hoping to get into today.
oh yeah.
Maybe we will, but screen addiction, I feel it's an area that parents are themselves victims of before their children. Yeah.
Especially during these times,
Yeah.
we're all glued to our screens.
Do you feel that screen addiction has always been an issue over the last few years, or is it just in the lockdown, or you don't really see it as a problematic trend?
I mean, it's been a huge source of conflict between parents and children for the past few years, I would say, based on the families that I work with. For some kids more than others. In the quarantine, a lot of parents have just kind of given up. This has been the general advice of lots of people like me. It's pick your battles. If children at least are functioning relatively well and they're happy and they're healthy, but they're spending an extra 1 or 2 hours on the screen, I would say let it slide. We're the generation of TV, right? Now this generation is like of the generation of tablets and phones, and we know there's enough data to prove that screens are very detrimental during the first 2 years of life for very young children. And then as children grow up, there are obviously so many guidelines as to what's appropriate content, what isn't, when are they allowed to watch it, how much are they allowed to watch it, and whether a parent is interacting with their child while they're on the screen. I think the biggest source of conflict that I've been seeing is that it's really messing up children's ability to wait because of the instant gratification of just clicking and getting a response, and especially when they're gaming. So, patience and frustration tolerance. Children are not playing with a lot of things like building a tower through blocks and watching it fall and then rebuilding it again, or
Hmm.
manipulating certain objects with their hands and
Yeah,
then dealing with that frustration. I mean, they're
true.
getting frustrated when they lose on Minecraft or they get killed in
Yeah,
Fortnite, right? But
yeah, so true.
I don't
They
know,
are.
you have a very different outlook on it.
My wife and I worry about them not being able to engage with basic mechanical toys and nature and playing with other kids without any technology. The worry comes from, I think, the type of content that they're engaged with on screens, whether it's Fortnite or a Netflix show. The on demand nature of entertainment and content is something that's never happened in human history, where you can, in a click of a button, decide between 1,000 colorful, high impact content shows on Netflix that are literally designed to grab your attention. And they're still not even on social media, my kids, but
Yeah,
that's just Netflix, where it's only one way. Imagine when
right.
they get into Facebook and stuff like that, where
Yeah,
it's a two-way interaction and a war for attention. I mean,
yeah,
even toddler content on TV, the fluorescent colors and the high-pitched voices, it's lab designed for attention, and it's hard to pry your child away from it. It's lunchtime and they're watching something, they won't have the second bite of their sandwich. It's a war between listening to this amazing Netflix show versus putting food in your mouth. It's insane.
yeah. And
And
maybe one other thing that I worry about is when they grow up a little bit, it's the validation that comes, like you said, from the social media likes and the comments.
mm,
Again, when I'm thinking about my clients that are 12 and 13 and how just bogged down they get over being excluded and they see their friends online and they're not
oh my
there,
God,
it's horrific.
it's
And just to be
poisonous.
an adolescent girl also on social media and have to
Ooh.
deal with all of the body shaming too, and
It's a minefield. We haven't regulated social media for teens yet. I mean, only
It's
last
true.
year did Instagram decide to hide
Yep.
the number of likes because it was legitimately causing adults anxiety. Imagine children. Oh
Yeah.
my God.
And when
Yeah,
you're still forming that sense of self, and
hmm
when you're still relying on a lot of your peers to validate that sense of self.
that's insane. You said we're the TV generation, you and I.
Yeah, and we
The
turned out okay, I
Yeah,
hope.
we're okay, I guess. I think teenagers are tablet generation. My kids, I would call them the TikTok generation, which is ultra hyper content injection.
I don't even know what it is. I've never tried it, so I don't even.
Okay, this is TikTok. TikTok is, imagine if Instagram was feeding you, instead of photos, was feeding you very short, fun videos
Yeah.
without you asking it to. So when the 10-second video ends, it gives you the second one. If you want it to stop, you have to actively make it stop. It's psychotic. And they have a great platform for you to create your own videos.
Yeah.
It's actually cool if your kid wants to learn how to edit and combine videos and do sound. It's actually cool in that way. But
But we need to tap into what kids are actually learning from all of these different platforms. And I'm
yeah,
sure there are so many benefits. And until now, there's no real hard evidence that screens are the devil and they're so bad,
yeah,
minus the very early years in terms of brain development.
yeah.
But I mean,
For sure. It's like with marijuana. If you're an adult having a joint, it's not going to hurt you. But if you're a child, then it's going to cause, brain development issues. The same way also with violent video games. I mean, the US has had so many reports about, is that causing violent school shootings? And apparently not. I mean, from the
no,
data that I'm looking at, it's not.
not if the child is not aggressive. So
Exactly.
it's not.
Yeah, yeah. And you
But
look at
if
Japan.
children, yeah,
Japan has even more violent video game culture, and they don't have school shootings. It's the guns.
no.
um, uh, So we've been locked down now for a month and a half where kids are not going to school and parents are having to face their kids a lot more and teach them and be with them a lot more. And parents themselves are stuck at home. What can you tell us, especially here in Jordan, from what you've been seeing? What kind of advice do you have?
Maybe two main issues. The first one is avoid lying to your child, especially now, because what parents really sometimes underestimate is when kids don't have answers to questions that are in their brains, and because of the way that a child's brain works and imagination development, they might build up a scenario that's way scarier than the truth. So it's really important to offer at least some grounding and some information, even if you think that it's a little bit unsettling. I mean, obviously be age appropriate, but I think just offer concrete facts about what's happening, what might continue to happen. Children deal with matter of fact and honesty better than we ever expect. And it gives them this sense of comfort and a sense of security knowing that their parents aren't keeping them in the dark. My second main tip is we don't necessarily know what impact COVID-19 is having on children's mental health. But what we do know from data is that one of the strongest predictors of children's success in terms of mental health and well being is their interaction and their positive relationships with their parents. Communication that's positive with your child will most likely come out of this period relatively, God willing, inshallah, unharmed. This is the strongest predictor. Your presence in your child's life in a very positive and comforting way, it tops all the other factors that are probably very scary for a lot of families.
Yeah. The child is more affected by how the parents are than by not being at school or the lockdown or learning about Corona. Yeah, it is
Yeah.
in the parents' hands, especially right now. You're right. I don't know how long we're going to have to be homeschooling for.
Yeah.
Schools have been hit suddenly with that task of arranging for homeschooling.
And parents too. I mean,
And
this is not
parents.
a task parents are equipped for.
Yeah.
So,
I wonder if
so
if you had to bet money, would you say in 9 months from now, will the birth rate be a lot higher because
oh my
people are locked
gosh.
in, or will be much lower because people are like, I don't want to bring kids into this world?
Or because they can't stand their partner
Yeah, or because they
due
can't
to
stand their
lockdown.
partner. Yeah, yeah. So
Man,
more
I don't
reasons
know.
not to have kids.
It's an ongoing joke. Like, what's gonna be higher, the divorce rate or the birth rate? So I'm not even. I don't know. I don't know if I'm gonna bet money on either one.
I hope more people in Jordan and across the world follow your path, helping out kids and
Thank
parents.
you.
It's an amazing and noble area of work, and I'm sure it gives you a lot of joy.
It does. I feel so lucky to go to work every day.
Amazing. And now you're actually doing it from your own home. Is this
Yes.
sustainable, or
Man,
especially with the parent-kid playtime? That's probably something that doesn't work as well.
no, I don't like it at all. I
Yeah,
miss being in the playroom with kids. I miss
yeah.
not being directive because I do a non directive play therapy approach with them. But online, it's way more directive, unfortunately. So I'm missing my playroom. I'm missing the kids that I work with so much.
When are you guys allowed back to practice physically at your offices?
I'm generally following the guidelines of the government in terms of them saying, hopefully, if we're 2 weeks of zero reported cases, then slowly we can open up because I have a huge responsibility of sterilizing all of my toys after each child comes in. It's challenging, and
Wow.
even for me and for my own family, like the social distancing is still important.
It's a very delicate and sensitive issue, the
Yeah,
sterilization now. It's become the major issue in every sector. My God, it's a new world. I hope you get back soon.
I hope
And
so too.
it was amazing talking to you today, Sirsa.
Thank you, Imad. I'm so excited about how this is going to grow, and I wish you the best of luck moving forward with it.
Thank you. Thanks so much.